4,000 cuts. That works out to roughly 37 cuts per minute, or 1 every 1.6 seconds. That's how many cuts there are in The Bourne Ultimatum. And on the heels of discussing how I feel we as filmmakers need to cut less, this film's insanely fast-paced shooting and cutting style just works. So why is it that both of these films have such a similar style, yet somehow feel so incredibly different? One is an Academy Award-winning film, 3 Oscars, including 1 for film editing, and the other feels like a cheap streaming movie trying to convince you that it's a Hollywood blockbuster. And I think the difference comes down to authenticity and intention. The filmmaking language of The Bourne Ultimatum feels authentic to itself. The camera work, the editing, the lens choices, the pacing, all feel like they belong to that world. There's a great review of the film that I think perfectly encapsulates this. If it feels like a non-stop demolition derby, at least there's a responsible driver at the wheel. And I think that's exactly it. Paul Greengrass makes the chaos feel intentional. The twitchy camera work and aggressive editing aren't just because they look cool, they're a part of the very specific visual language that he's delved up. And I think the lens selection plays a huge role in that feeling as well. When comparing 2 of the major chase sequences from these movies, something immediately stood out to me. The Bourne Ultimatum seems to rely heavily on longer lenses that compress that image, and the compression makes everything feel more claustrophobic, crowded, and intense. You feel trapped inside the chaos with these characters. Taken 3 does use longer compressed lenses in certain moments, but it will then suddenly cut to these extremely wide close-ups while jumping between seemingly opposing camera movements. Sometimes you'll have these smoother, almost like gimbal-esque shots, but then jump right back into a jarring handheld shot as it switches between all different types of camera angles and focal lengths. And for me personally, that completely changes the feeling. It pulls me out of the chaotic, claustrophobic world that I think the movie is trying to create. It just feels inconsistent, choppy, disjointed, but not necessarily in the way the filmmakers intended. And that's an important distinction, because the Bourne movies, Ultimatum specifically, are inherently choppy and chaotic. But there's almost a poetic quality to the chaos. It doesn't feel random, even when it looks random. There's a system underneath it all. And I think that's where Taken 3 falls short, and in a number of other ways. It feels like they set out with the intention of emulating the Bourne movies. I can almost imagine a pre-production meeting saying, hey, we're gonna shoot this like the Bourne movies. And technically they did. You can see the influence everywhere. But they failed to capture the actual essence of what made that filmmaking style work in the first place. And when you put these movies side by side, you can clearly see what they're trying to do, but in my opinion, they just never quite understood why it worked. And I think that's something audiences can feel. Authenticity. Whether it's music, painting, photography, filmmaking, I think audiences are incredibly good at sensing when something feels authentic versus when something feels like an imitation. Now, that's not to say that everyone is going to love the Bourne Ultimatum and its style. There's plenty of people who absolutely hate this style, but even within a style you may not personally enjoy, you can still recognize when a filmmaker has a clear intention behind it. And interestingly enough, I think the original Taken actually feels much closer to that Bourne style than Taken 3 does. It doesn't have the same incoherent wannabe version of the style that Taken 3 does, and I think a big part of that comes down to the filmmakers themselves. Taken was directed by Pierre Morel, and Taken 3 was directed by Olivier Megaton. And then you have Paul Greengrass. He knew what he wanted his movies to feel like, and more importantly, he was able to assemble a team that understood that vision and executed it to perfection. And I know I've been harping on the idea that movies need to cut less and that we need to give shots more time to breathe, and I still believe in that. But that doesn't mean every single movie should be slow. Every story has different needs. I wouldn't expect a slow burn psychological thriller to be shot like The Bourne Ultimatum. And I wouldn't expect an action movie like Bourne to suddenly adopt the visual language of a slow burn drama. The point isn't that one style is better than the other. The point is that you need to understand what your story calls for. What style, framing, composition, lens choice, camera movement, and editing rhythm will best serve the story you're trying to tell. But whatever style you choose, make sure it comes from a place of intention and authenticity. Because when the intention disappears, the work becomes hollow. And when you're simply copying what someone else did without understanding why it worked, audiences can feel it. So don't just ask, how do I make my movie look like this? Ask yourself, why does this work? And what does my story actually need? Be authentic, be intentional.